Earl's beacon. Earl Thompson leaned back in his creaky wooden chair, the kind that had sat in his Lubbock, Texas, home for decades. At 67, his silver hair caught the fading glow of a March sunset, spilling red across the cotton fields stretching miles beyond his cracked porch window. The air smelled faintly of dust and diesel, a reminder of the massive solar panels, 50 feet tall, looming like silent giants half a mile out. It was 2082, and those panels powered what was left of a thirsty earth, but Earl paid them little mind. Instead, he fiddled with the dials on his Zenith radio, a boxy relic from 1963 with chipped walnut casing. Static hissed through the speaker, a comforting drone in the stillness of his single-story house. Outside, a cool breeze rustled the brittle stalks, carrying the evening chill, about 62 degrees Fahrenheit, through the screen door. Earl's gnarled hands, speckled with age spots, turned the tuning knob slowly, searching for a ghost of a signal. He didn't expect much. The AM stations had mostly died out by the 2050s. But the ritual kept him grounded, like tending the patchy vegetable garden out back or brewing coffee in the old percolator Clara had loved. The house was quiet now, just him and the hum of that radio. He glanced at the empty chair across the room, where she used to sit knitting, and felt the familiar pang. 10 years had passed since Clara's death, and he still missed her voice. Out here, 20 miles from Lubbock proper, it was just Earl, the fields, and the stars starting to peek through the dusk. On the shelf beside the radio sat a faded Polaroid, its edges curling from time. Earl, 24 years old, grinned in a crisp NASA uniform, standing in the Houston control room back in '79. He'd been a wire and tube man, a radio engineer who kept the satellites talking during Skylab and beyond. His proudest work was the Beacon Network, a hush-hush project in the '80s to guide humanity's first space colonies. Alpha, Beta, Gamma, with signals bounced across the cosmos. The photo caught him mid-laugh, surrounded by clunky computers and ashtrays full of cigarette butts. Those were the days when he felt the universe was his to wire together, one frequency at a time. The project got axed in '90, budget cuts, they said, and Earl drifted back to Texas. He and Clara built this house, raised a daughter who now lived in Dallas, and settled into a quieter life. When Clara passed from cancer in '72, Earl boxed up most of his NASA gear, but he kept the radio. Some nights, he'd tune it to 550 kilohertz, half hoping to catch an old broadcast of Johnny Cash or a preacher's sermon, like the ones he'd heard as a kid in the '60s. The static was his companion now, a tether to those long-gone days when he'd stay up late, plotting signal paths to the stars while Clara brought him coffee. He traced a finger over the photo, smudging dust from its frame. At 67, he wasn't that young buck anymore, knees stiff, eyes weaker, but the memories still crackled like a live wire in his chest. Earl shuffled to the kitchen, the linoleum cool under his socks, and poured a mug of black coffee from the percolator. The rich, bitter scent filled the air as he settled back into his chair, the radio still buzzing softly. He turned the dial again, settling on a faint hum at 620 kilohertz, nothing clear, just white noise to fill the silence. Through the window, Orion's belt glittered above the fields, a sight he and Clara used to watch from the porch swing. The temperature had dipped to 60 degrees, and a coyote howled somewhere in the distance, a lonesome sound that matched the night. He sipped his coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands, and let his mind wander. Life wasn't grand anymore, no missions, no deadlines, just these small routines he'd carved out. The garden needed weeding, the radio's tubes might need swapping, but it was enough. At his age, Earl figured he'd earned this quiet, a slow fade into the years like the sun dipping below the horizon. He set the mug down, leaned back, and watched the stars, feeling a flicker of that old wonder from his NASA days. The world had moved on, solar farms, space stations, but out here, time felt softer, kinder. He set the mug down, leaned back, and watched the stars, feeling a flicker of that old wonder from his NASA days, until the radio snapped him out of it with a sound he couldn't ignore. Earl froze in his chair, the coffee mug still warm in his hands as the radio pulsed with that odd, rhythmic beat, dash, like a heartbeat from another time. The sound sliced through the static, sharp and clear against the soft hum of the Lubbock night. Outside, the wind had stilled, leaving the air at a crisp 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and the stars above the cotton fields seemed to sharpen in the dark. He set the mug down on the scratched oak table, his eyes locked on the Zenith's glowing dial. At 67, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but this wasn't imagination. It was real, deliberate, like the Morse code drills he'd run back in Houston decades ago. He leaned closer, turning the volume knob up with a trembling hand. The signal looped, steady as a metronome. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Earl's mind raced, rusty gears grinding back to life. It wasn't any AM station he knew. No music, no preacher's drawl, just this cryptic chatter cutting through the 620 kilohertz band. He grabbed a pencil and a scrap of paper from the table, an old grocery receipt, and scribbled the pattern as it repeated. His heart thumped harder than it had in years, a mix of curiosity and something like dread. The last time he decoded anything was in '85, troubleshooting a satellite glitch for NASA. This felt different, urgent, personal, like a ghost tapping on his window 20 miles from nowhere. The pulses stopped for a moment, then started again, louder, as if insisting he listen. Earl swallowed, the coffee souring in his throat, and muttered, "What in the hell is this?" Earl shoved his chair back and shuffled to the closet, the floorboards creaking under his socks. He yanked out a dented metal toolbox, a relic from his NASA days, and hauled it to the table. The radio kept chattering, ... as he pried the lid open, revealing a mess of wires, a voltmeter, and a yellowed notebook stuffed with handwritten frequencies. His hands, stiff from years of gardening instead of soldering, fumbled as he hooked the voltmeter to the Zenith's guts. The needle twitched, confirming the signal wasn't some fluke from a loose tube. It was strong, steady, coming from somewhere way beyond Lubbock's dusty plains. He flipped through the notebook, pages crackling, until he found a list of old satellite bands from the Beacon network. His eyes narrowed as he matched the signal's rhythm to a memory. Beacon 7, one of the last rigs he'd worked on in '89, launched to guide Colony Alpha 300,000 miles past Mars. It was supposed to go dark after the project got scrapped, no power, no purpose. Yet here it was, whispering through his radio like a voice from a grave. Earl adjusted the dial, fine-tuning to 621 kilohertz, and the pattern sharpened. He scribbled faster, translating the Morse into letters, BSU7. His breath caught. 50 years silent, and now this? He tapped the table, muttering, "Ain't no damn way." The signal wasn't just alive, it was calling out, and somehow, it had found him, alone in a house 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. Earl sat back, the pencil dropping from his hand as the radio's signal shifted. The Morse stretched into longer bursts, and he snatched the receipt again, decoding as fast as his shaky fingers allowed. The words formed slowly. Beacon 7. Alpha needs help. Last relay active. He stared at the scrawl, the room tilting slightly. Alpha, Colony Alpha, was a dream from the '80s, a speck of humanity seeded beyond Mars, abandoned when funding dried up. He'd assumed it died out, its 200 souls lost to the void. But this message, piercing the night from a satellite 300,000 miles away, said otherwise. No, it couldn't know him. But he knew it. Knew every wire he'd run through Beacon 7 back in '89, and that meant he was the last one who could answer the call. He stumbled to the window, peering at the sky where Orion hung like a silent witness. His mind churned. How could Beacon 7 still function? How did it know him? The air felt colder now, maybe 55 degrees, but sweat beaded on his forehead. He'd been the lead on its comms design, sure, but that was a lifetime ago. The signal looped again, insistent. ERL, last hope. A chill ran down his spine, not from the night, but from the weight of it. Someone, or something, out there was alive, desperate, and reaching for him across half a century. Earl sank into his chair, the radio's glow casting shadows on his lined face. He thought of Clara, how she'd urge him to listen, to help. The toolbox sat open, the notebook's pages fluttering in a draft. He didn't know if he could do this, 67 years old, out of the game, just a man with a garden and a radio. But the signal wouldn't let go, tugging at a part of him he'd buried with his NASA badge. He whispered to the empty room, "All right, you old bastard. What do you want from me?" Earl sat hunched over the kitchen table, the radio's eerie signal. ERL, Last Hope, still looping in the dim glow of his Lubbock home. The clock ticked past midnight, the temperature outside dropping to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, but he barely noticed. His coffee had gone cold, the mug forgotten beside the scribbled receipt. 50 years ago, he'd have jumped at a challenge like this, wired a fix, called the team, saved the day. Now, at 67, his knees ached just thinking about it. But the message gnawed at him, a plea from a past he couldn't shake. He grabbed his old rotary phone, a relic like the radio, and dialed a number he hadn't touched in decades, NASA's Houston line, now routed to their Orbital Ops Division. A sleepy voice answered, some kid half his age, but when Earl barked, Beacon 7's alive, and it's yelling my name. The line went silent. An hour later, a sleek black drone hummed down from the sky, landing in his cotton field 200 yards out. Two NASA techs in crisp jumpsuits knocked on his door, their faces a mix of skepticism and urgency. Mr. Thompson, the older one said, if you're right, Alpha's still out there. We've got a shuttle prepped. Can you handle it? Earl stared at them, then at the radio. Clara's voice echoed in his head. You're too stubborn to quit. He nodded, gruffly. Get me up there. They handed him a comms tablet and a duffel with a patched-up spacesuit, his size, from the 80s stash. Earl slung it over his shoulder, feeling the weight of a decision he couldn't unmake. The shuttle lifted off at dawn, a quiet hum vibrating through Earl's bones as it climbed past the 50-foot solar panels dotting the Texas plains. He sat strapped into a padded seat, the NASA techs monitoring screens while he gripped the armrests. At 10,000 feet, the sky darkened, and by 100 miles up, the Earth curved below like a blue marble wrapped in clouds. Earl's breath caught, same view he'd seen on monitors in '79, but it hit different. The shuttle, a sleek 60-foot needle called Orion's Spur, wasn't like the clunky Apollos he'd known. It was smooth, fast, cutting through space at 17,000 miles an hour. He pressed his face to the window, the suit's collar stiff against his neck. Beyond Earth, the stars didn't twinkle. They burned steady, sharp as pinpricks. The text chattered about coordinates. Beacon 7 orbiting at 300,000 miles, but Earl tuned them out. He saw the moon slide by, a gray ghost 240,000 miles off, and remembered watching Apollo 11 land on a grainy TV with Clara. Now here he was, an old man chasing a signal no one else believed. The shuttle's interior glowed with soft blue lights, screens flickering with data, but Earl felt a pang of nostalgia for the old control rooms, dials, switches, cigarette smoke. This was cleaner, colder, a world he barely fit into. Yet as Earth shrank to a speck, he felt a flicker of that young engineer's thrill, the one who dreamed of wiring the stars. The tech beside him tapped his shoulder. 2 hours to Beacon 7, sir. You ready? Earl grunted. Been ready since '79. The shuttle docked with Beacon 7, a hulking 80-foot satellite drifting in the void, its solar panels chipped and pocked from decades of micrometeorites. Earl suited up, helmet, gloves, oxygen rig, his hands fumbling with zippers he hadn't touched since training. At 67, he wasn't spry, but muscle memory kicked in as he floated out the airlock, tethered to the ship by a 50-foot line. The tech stayed aboard, guiding him via comms, but this was his show. He gripped a toolkit strapped to his chest, the same kind he'd used in Houston, and pulled himself along the satellite's hull. The signal pulsed through his helmet's radio, louder now, ... Earl found the comms panel, a 3-foot square of faded metal, and pried it open with a wrench. Inside, wires dangled like a bird's nest, some scorched from solar flares. He squinted through his visor, the stars reflecting off the scratched glass, and traced the circuits with a gloved finger. Same damn setup, he muttered. Back in '89, he'd designed this rig, redundant relays, AM boosters, built to last. He pulled a voltmeter from his kit, the needle jumping as he tested connections. The tech's voice crackled. Can you fix it? Earl snorted. Can a hog find mud? He spliced a frayed wire, hands steady despite the cold, 20 degrees below zero out here, and rerouted power from a backup cell. The signal sharpened, and he patched in his NASA tablet, uploading specs from memory. This wasn't guesswork. It was 40 years of know-how, dusted off and humming again. The panel sparked, then glowed faintly. Earl grinned inside his helmet. You're talking, old girl. Now let's hear what you've got to say. Earl floated beside Beacon 7, the 80-foot satellite glinting dully against the endless black, 300,000 miles from Earth. His helmet's comms crackled with the signal ... now synced to the NASA tablet clipped to his suit. He tapped the screen, and the decoded message scrolled. Alpha oxygen 12 hours. Relay failing. Send help. His stomach dropped. Colony Alpha, a speck of humanity he'd wired into existence decades ago, was choking out there, beyond Mars. 12 hours, half a day, to fix this rust bucket or lose them forever. He scanned the satellite's guts through his visor, the temperature outside a brutal 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The comms panel glowed faintly, but the relay system, the heart that bounced signals to Alpha, was a mess. Solar flares had fried half the circuits, and the antenna, a 20-foot dish, hung crooked, bent from some long-ago impact. Earl cursed under his breath, his oxygen gauge showing 8 hours left in his tank. The text back in the shuttle, Orion Spur, chimed in. Thompson, we've got no ships close enough to Alpha in time. That relay's their only shot. Earl gripped his wrench tighter. At 67, he wasn't built for heroics. His back ached, his hands shook, but this wasn't about him. It was about 200 souls he'd promised to keep connected, a promise buried since '89. The signal pulsed again, weaker now, like a fading heartbeat. He muttered, "Hang on, folks. I ain't done yet." Earl hauled himself to the relay core, a 4-foot box of tangled wires and scorched boards, tethered by his 50-foot line. His toolkit clanked against his suit as he pried the casing off, revealing a snarl of copper and steel. The tech's voices buzzed in his helmet. "Power's at 10%. Can you boost it?" He ignored them, focusing on the job. His gloved hands, clumsy from age and the suit's bulk, fished out a soldering gun and a spool of wire from his kit. The cold bit through, his breath fogging the visor, but he worked fast, splicing a burned-out relay with steady, practiced moves. He remembered nights in Houston, hunched over blueprints with a cigarette dangling, wiring Beacon 7 to scream across space. Now, 300,000 miles from home, it was the same dance: connect red to red, ground the black, pray it holds. The antenna was next. Earl kicked off the hull, floating to the dish, and wrestled it back into alignment, grunting as his shoulders screamed. He bolted it down, then patched the signal booster with a jury-rigged circuit from his spares. Sweat stung his eyes, his oxygen dipping to 6 hours. The tablet blinked, power at 15%, then 20%. The signal strengthened, but it wasn't enough. He rerouted the last juice from the solar cells, hands trembling as sparks popped in the vacuum. "Come on, you stubborn mule," he growled, slamming the panel shut. The text crackled. "It's working, signal's up." Earl floated there, chest heaving, watching the dish hum faintly against the stars. The relay kicked in, a steady pulse beaming toward Alpha, 300,000 miles away. Earl's tablet flashed, signal locked. Rescue dispatched. ETA 10 hours. He exhaled, a shaky laugh fogging his visor. 10 hours, Alpha might make it, might breathe again because of him. He clipped the tablet to his suit, his oxygen at 5 hours now, and leaned against Beacon 7's hull. The stars stretched out, endless, and he felt the weight of it, 67 years old, half dead in space, but he'd done it. The text cheered through the comms. "Thompson, you're a legend. Shuttle's coming to grab you." Earl nodded, too tired to reply. His hands ached, his suit's heater struggling against the 30 below cold. He'd pushed too hard. Rerouting power had drained his own reserves, and the suit's battery blinked red, down to 20%. He could feel it, the slow creep of exhaustion, the way his breaths grew shallow. The shuttle was 30 minutes out, but his tank wouldn't last. He patched the comms one last time, sending a burst to Alpha. "Hold tight. Help's coming." The signal flared bright, then steadied, a lifeline stretched across the void. Earl slumped, tethered to the satellite, his eyes on the dish he'd fixed. It wasn't perfect, patches and prayers, but it worked. He'd kept his promise, 50 years late. The stars blurred as his oxygen dipped to 4 hours, his body sinking into a heavy calm. He whispered, "Clara, I got him," and closed his eyes, the relay's hum fading into silence. Victory, fragile as it was, glowed in that dark expanse, a light he'd lit for strangers he'd never meet. Earl drifted beside Beacon 7, the 80-foot satellite humming faintly 300,000 miles from Earth. His oxygen gauge blinked at 4 hours, the suit's heater sputtering against the 30-degree below zero cold of space. The stars stretched out like a quilt of light, and he let his mind wander, tethered to the hull by a 50-foot line. He'd done it, fixed the relay, sent the signal, given Alpha a shot at survival. At 67, with creaky joints and a heart that had seen better days, he'd pulled off what no one else could. He thought back to Lubbock, the cotton fields stretching 20 miles under a Texas sunset, the Zenith radio buzzing on his table. Then Houston, 79, wiring satellites with a cigarette in one hand and coffee in the other, Clara waiting at home with a smile. Those years felt close now, not decades gone, nights plotting signals to the stars, days dreaming of colonies like Alpha. He'd been part of something big once, before budget cuts and time wore him down. Fixing Beacon 7 wasn't just about circuits. It was about keeping a promise he'd made at 24, a promise to connect humanity across the void. His breath fogged the visor, slow and shallow, and he chuckled softly. "Guess I still had it in me," he murmured, the sound swallowed by his helmet. The tablet clipped to his suit glowed faintly, showing the rescue ship's ETA to Alpha. 9 hours. They'd make it. That was enough. The shuttle's voice crackled through his comms, sharp against the silence. "Thompson, this is Orion's Spur. We're 20 minutes out. Hang on, we're bringing you home." Earl opened his eyes, the stars sharpening into focus. Home. Lubbock's dusty porch, the garden he'd neglected, the empty chair where Clara used to sit. He could almost smell the barbecue ribs smoking out back from their Sunday cookouts, hear the roar of a Longhorns game on the old TV. He could picture it, sipping coffee at 62 degrees Fahrenheit under Orion's belt, the radio static his only company. But out here, 300,000 miles from Texas, he'd lit a beacon for 200 souls. The suit's battery dipped to 15%, oxygen at 3 hours. He wouldn't last the trip back, not with the tank fading and his body spent. He tapped the comms, voice raspy but firm. "Negative, Spur stay on course. I'm good here." The text reply came fast, panicked. "Sir, we can't leave you. You're a damn hero." Earl smiled, a tired curve behind the visor. Hero. He hadn't set out for that, just to fix what he'd built, to finish what he'd started. He didn't need the title, just the quiet knowing he'd done right by those folks out there. Alpha was alive because of him. That was the win. Going back meant a quiet fade in Lubbock, but staying meant something else, staying with the stars, with Clara's memory, with the signal he'd sent. He glanced at Beacon 7, its dish steady now, beaming hope across the black. "You've got your orders," he said. "Tell him Earl Thompson signed off up here." The line went quiet, then a reluctant, "Copy that, sir." He switched the comms off, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. Earl reached into his suit's pocket, fingers numb from the cold, and pulled out a small recorder, a keepsake from Clara, taped with her voice from 68. He'd carried it up here, a last piece of home. His oxygen ticked to 2 hours, the suit's heater down to 10%, but he felt warm somehow, calm. He pressed play, and her voice filled his helmet, soft and crackling. "Earl, don't work too late. Supper's waiting." A recording from a night he'd stayed at NASA, plotting Beacon 7's launch. He closed his eyes, picturing her in their kitchen, apron on, the smell of cornbread in the air. Through the visor, he saw a faint flicker, Alpha's direction, 300,000 miles off. The rescue ship would reach them soon, and they'd breathe because of him. He rewound the tape, played it again, her words a tether to a life he'd lived well. "Supper's waiting," she said, and he whispered back, "I'm coming, Han." The stars blurred, his breath slowing in the 35 below chill. He didn't fight it, didn't need to. The tablet blinked one last time. Alpha signal stable. Good enough. Earl let his hand rest on Beacon 7, the metal cold even through his glove. He'd wired it to talk, and now it sang, a steady pulse across the void. His eyes drifted shut, Clara's voice looping soft and sure, the recorder's battery fading with his own. He smiled, weightless, as the satellite hummed beside him. Not a bad way to go, 67 years, a Texas kid turned star fixer, leaving a light on for strangers. The universe stretched out, vast and quiet, and Earl slipped into it, peaceful at last. Earl's suit went dark, the oxygen gauge frozen at zero, his body still tethered to Beacon 7's hull 300,000 miles from Earth. The stars burned steady around him, a silent vigil for a man who'd given his last breath to keep a signal alive. Back on the Orion's spur, the techs watched his vitals flatline, their voices hushed. "Thompson's gone," one muttered, punching in a report for NASA. But out there, beyond Mars, Colony Alpha flickered back to life. The rescue ship docked 9 hours later, its crew hauling oxygen tanks into the habitat's 200-foot dome. A grainy transmission crackled from Alpha's comms. "Beacon 7 signal received. We're breathing. Thank you." They didn't know Earl's name, not yet, but his work had saved them. Days later, NASA brass convened in Houston, 800 miles from Lubbock. The techs recounted Earl's final stand, how a 67-year-old retiree, armed with a wrench and a 50-year-old playbook, rewired a dead satellite in 30 below zero space. He wouldn't come back, they said he was good up there. The director, a gray-haired woman who'd grown up on Apollo stories, nodded. "Rename it," she ordered. "Call it Earl's Beacon. Make sure Alpha knows who pulled them through." A plaque went up in the control room, next to faded photos of Skylab. Earl Thompson, 2015 to 2082. Last keeper of the signal. His daughter in Dallas got the call, tears mixing with pride as she clutched that old Polaroid of him in '79. Earl hadn't just fixed a relay, he'd left a mark on the stars. Back in Lubbock, the cotton fields lay quiet under a late March dusk, the temperature settling at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Earl's house sat empty, the Zenith radio still on the table, its dial stuck at 620 kilohertz. A NASA courier dropped off a package for his daughter, Earl's toolkit, the recorder with Clara's voice, and a note from the spur crew. He signed off smiling. That night, a faint signal pulsed through the radio, not static but a steady hum, Earl's last patch from Beacon 7, bouncing back to Earth. It wasn't much, just a whisper from 300,000 miles away, but it filled the room like a ghost of his hands on the dials. Across town, a retired ham radio operator picked it up too, scribbling the frequency in a logbook. Word spread among the old-timers, guys who'd grown up twisting antennas in the '60s, chasing signals like Earl once did. They tuned in, nodding at the familiar rhythm, not knowing it was his final send-off. In Houston, NASA archived the signal, a digital echo of a man who'd wired the stars before most of them were born. It tied back to that Polaroid on Earl's shelf, him at 24, grinning in a control room, dreaming of colonies like Alpha. The past and present met in that hum, a thread from his youth to his last act, looping through the Texas night like a song he'd once played for Clara. The Lubbock sky stretched wide that evening, Orion's belt gleaming above the 50-foot solar panels dotting the plains. Earl's garden sat untended, tomato vines curling in the 58-degree air, but there was a stillness to it, a peace that hadn't been there before. Up in space, Earl's beacon kept humming, its 20-foot dish aimed at Alpha, a steady pulse linking two specks of humanity across the void. The rescue crew reported Alpha's survival, 200 people, kids included, now rebuilding with air in their lungs. Earl's name trickled into their story, a quiet legend from a Texas field to a Martian fringe. Down below, the radio in his house played on, its signal fading as the battery died, but the sound lingered in the minds of those who'd heard it. His daughter drove out from Dallas a week later, standing on the porch with the recorder in hand. She pressed play, Clara's voice, supper's waiting, and smiled through tears, knowing Earl had found his way home, wherever that was now. The stars above shone brighter, or maybe it just felt that way, a canvas he'd touched one last time. At 67, he'd traded a quiet fade for a final flare, leaving the universe a little less lonely. The fields rustled in the breeze, and Lubbock settled into night, the kind of peace Earl had earned. Out there, 300,000 miles up, he rested with the stars, his beacon, his signal, his mark. For a man who'd spent his life connecting things, it was fitting, a Texas boy forever wired to the sky.